Let me introduce to you the four people here on the stage. Sitting closest to me, looking way better than I do. This is totally unfair.
Hey, thanks.
Is Alejandro Gibbes de Gac. He is the founder of the Springboard Collaborative, which is a nonprofit designed to close the literacy gap by bringing together teachers and parents. Alejandro, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Sitting next to Alejandro is Sarah Heminger. She's the co-founder of Frayed, which is a program that empowers struggling teenagers by surrounding them with families of 6 to 10 mentors. And we'll kind of redefine what we mean by family in a minute. Sarah, welcome. Next to Sarah is Dylan Tett. Dylan Tett, who's the founder of the Bastion community of resilience, a housing community for veterans and families with life-altering injuries. Dylan, thanks for making time for us. And next to Dylan is Aisha Butler, the co-founder and president of RAGE, the Resident Association of Greater Englewood, in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago. Aisha, glad to have you with us.
Thank you.
Let's hear it for all four of our guests this morning. Alejandro, let me start with you and your story. Tell us a little bit about the Springboard Collaborative and how that came together. It's designed, as we said, to close this literacy gap, and as I understand it, part of your process that kind of led you to this was being a first grade teacher in North Philly. Is that right?
It's true. And for me, the journey began long before I was a teacher and even before I was born. I'm half Chilean, half Puerto Rican. My dad, in 1973, was taken as a political prisoner in his native Chile while writing and directing Libertad, Libertad, a play in protest of Pinochet's dictatorship. It went over about as well as you'd expect it to. He was a political prisoner for years, tortured, lucky to make it out alive. And even luckier to meet my mom while living in exile in Paris. My mom is the youngest of 12 in Puerto Rico, the first in her family to go to college, and she was in Paris on a graduate school scholarship. Two of them met at a theater festival where my dad pretended he had the perfect role for my mom, she pretended she was an actress, and my sister and I were the byproducts. Eventually, they decided to immigrate to the US so that Melina and I could have access to better educational opportunities, even though it meant giving up their own theater dreams, the kind of a sacrifice that only a parent would make. And growing up in a home with little money, but lots of ambition, it taught me firsthand that parents' love for their children is the single greatest and most underutilized natural resource in education. So I took that perspective with me, and I'll mention also that the strategy here was, let's rent the tiniest house in an overwhelmingly affluent community so that my sister and I could go to a good school. The challenge was that we were the only brown and poor kids in town, and as you can imagine, middle schoolers like to make me pretty aware of that. Mm-hmm. So my sister and I were completely and deliberately unwoven from the social fabric, isolated, and almost by necessity, I developed a me against the world mentality, kind of the simultaneous superiority and inferiority complex that so many immigrants and others grapple with. And for me, this idea of individual triumph in the face of adversity became the fuel that my engine runs on, and yet I experienced achievement and isolation in equal measure.
That must have been challenging for you as you got into the classroom. You spent 2 years as a first grade teacher.
Yeah.
So I imagine that as you see the difference between what you grew up with and what some of the kids in North Philly were growing up with, you know, there was some friction there that started to grate after a while.
In fact, it was the absence of friction that finally felt liberating. And in the sense that I was teaching in a Puerto Rican neighborhood in North Philly. In my students, I saw myself, and in their parents, I saw my own, a feeling of familiarity I hadn't grown up with. And it's more than just our shared language and complexion. It's the timeless truth you see in the eyes of any parent. Right? My students' parents gazed at their children with the same unconditional love, unbridled optimism, unwavering commitment with which my parents had gazed at me. And yet my school and our system approaches low-income parents as liabilities rather than as assets. Why don't we see in a low-income parent the same love, commitment, and potential we so easily recognize in the parents in this room? Yeah. And so for me, I realized this is my opportunity to weave. I founded Springboard Collaborative with the vision of closing the literacy gap by bridging the gap between home and school. We weave together teachers and low-income parents to help their kids read on grade level. And in a country where you can draw a straight line from fourth grade reading levels to incarceration rates, that can change lives.
Springboard, and I'll let you talk more about what it does, but Springboard kind of plays on this idea that parents are primary educators in their children's lives, where they have professional educators in the classroom, but that's not where kids spend most of their time. So it's like there's all of this time that goes unused that could be used to keep educating them if their parents were ready to kind of pick up the ball and run with it.
That's exactly it. Like in my classroom, I would picture my students' time as an orange. I only had them for a wedge. I have them for 25% of their waking hours that they're in the classroom, and yet the education sector is fixated on squeezing more and more juice from that wedge. If we don't find a way to bring families in and juice the rest of the orange, we'll never close the achievement gap, let alone the opportunity gap.
Were the parents that you reached out to eager to get involved, skeptical, confused? What was their initial reaction when you started to try to engage them on this?
They were starved for an opportunity to participate. We're working with low-income families who deal with all of the endemic challenges that people in poverty do, and many assume that means that they can't be involved in their child's education. If a third of them can't themselves read, how are they going to teach their children to read? And yet, in the challenge, there is so much potential. The families we work with have learned the hard way just how important it is for their child to have a better educational experience than they did. So if given a path for becoming a part of the process and an agent in their child's learning, they'll take it. In schools that struggle to get 10% of parents to show up at a report card conference, we get 91% of parents to attend a weekly training workshop, learn how to be a one-on-one literacy coach for their kid at home, build reading habits that persist long after the program has ended, and ultimately not only double their students' annual reading progress and put them on the path to being a literate participant in their education, but just as importantly, they have the experience of setting and achieving goals with their children. And that has implications in literacy, of course, but far beyond. It has the potential to put families on an upward spiral and create a virtuous cycle where there has only been an experience of repeated failure.
And what about in terms of weaving them to the larger community? Have you found receptiveness in terms of other communities within Philly to try to support these parents? Has that been kind of a tough sell? How's that gone?
Yeah, it's gone incredibly well. We operate now in 13 cities, and across the board, we get the same family turnout, and not only do the families build habits, but the teachers also shift their mindsets. For teachers, you might think it's difficult in a context where people become defensive almost by necessity, to get them to embrace one additional responsibility, family engagement. One more thing, I can hardly keep up with what I need to do in my classroom, but there isn't a teacher that doesn't have the experience of leading a workshop, having every family member attend, and realizing, I'm not alone anymore. These are the classroom assistants I never even knew that I had, right? These are the only people that have one-on-one time with children, the thing that any teacher dreams of. These are the experts on their own children. There is no smaller classroom than a family's living room, and there's no better way to personalize instruction than through a parent. What's more personal than a parent and a child sharing a book at bedtime?
Yeah, no smaller and perhaps no more effective classroom, indeed, than the table that a parent shares with their child. That idea of not being alone or not being alone anymore, not feeling alone, is also kind of at the heart of what Sarah Heminger has been working on. So Sarah, let me give you a chance to talk about Thread, a program that empowers struggling teenagers by surrounding them with families of mentors. I put families in quotes, and I'll let you kind of get into that. Talk about how Thread came about as a result of your own experience. The way you described it to me, the young people that you worked with ended up doing as much for you as you did for them, but describe what that need was for you.
Sure. So, Thread's ultimate goal is to address this challenge of social isolation. And we've been working in Baltimore now for 15 years to build a community where everyone feels deeply seen and known and loved. And the reason why is we think this is the best way to get to true social and economic justice. why do I care about this? So this is for me, the intersection of my childhood and my husband's. My husband grew up in a working class family. His mom was in a really bad car accident. A week later, a second car accident. She couldn't walk for about 8 months, so she ended up losing their job. They lost their home. They moved from suburban Indianapolis, so think cornfields, to public housing in the inner city. She became very depressed and addicted to Dilaudid. And things spiraled out of control to the point where she was using so heavily that she began dealing to support her habit. And so he essentially went from cornfields to crack house in about 18 months, and that time period coincided with his transition into high school. So he missed a ton of school because he was worried about things like food, water, electricity, and ended up failing all his classes. And there was a group of teachers who, instead of saying, like, you can do better, you're just not working hard enough, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, they drove to his house and they would give him a ride to school, and they would pack him a lunch, and they would make sure that he had a place to do his laundry so that he had clean clothing. And so no one can decide for you to go to school, but they can make it a ton easier. He ended up becoming a straight A student, varsity athlete, went on to the Naval Academy. I joke that my first strategic planning process was to convince him to date me and then marry me, so it was a good training ground. And so the way that intersects with my story is I grew up in a family, very religious family, and when I was 8 years old, my father found out the pastor of our church was misusing money. And when my dad grew up in Woodstock, total social justice warrior. Yeah. And so when he found out, he revealed it, like that was the natural thing. And instead of firing the pastor, they decided to shun our family. So for 8 years, none of the children in the church could speak to me. The adults couldn't speak to me. This is the type of church you go to church 3 days a week. My own cousins, aunts, and uncles. At holidays, I had to be segregated in different rooms at my grandparents' house. And so fast forward a bit, I was in graduate school doing a PhD in biomedical engineering, of all things, and I'm very introverted. I didn't have any friends. It's a very competitive environment.
You went to Hopkins, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I didn't know how to make friends. I had no family in the area. I just wanted friends. And I was driving past Dunbar High School one day, and I think it probably would have only made sense to my brain, but I thought, oh, like there must be other kids inside of Dunbar that are just like Ryan, that are super smart, capable, distracted by things happening outside of school. And like, I bet they could be my friends. Ryan's my friend. Like, so to me, it felt like a very rational idea for someone who is desperate to be part of a community.
Describe Dunbar High School for us.
Fascinating. So Dunbar High School is one of two historically African-American high schools in Baltimore City. And, you know, when you think about Dunbar High School and the civil rights movement, you know, the intention of the movement was to bring about this social and economic justice. But if you look at Dunbar, it was racially segregated until 1956. But if you look at it today, what's happened when we've integrated the schools was we had white flight and then middle class black flight. So now Dunbar High School is not just racially segregated, it's segregated by class. And so in many ways, it's actually worse than it was in 1956.
So here you are, a grad student in biomedical engineering at Johns Hopkins University, and you drive past this poor black high school and think, ooh, friends. Like, wait, what was your plan to get in?
I didn't have one. I just, we were talking earlier, my spirit animal is a honey badger. So I had called for 2 weeks, no one would return my call. And so I went one day and just sat in the main office and said, I'm not gonna leave until someone speaks to me, which looking back on it was a really entitled, awful thing in terms of where my spirit was in the matter. But I did eventually meet with the principal, and I just asked, you know, is there a group of young people like Ryan who are academically underperforming but completely capable? And he said, of course, and so that was how we started. And so now we enroll students who rank in the bottom 25% of their class. The average GPA, for example, at Douglas High School of one of our cohorts was 0.15 on a 4.0 scale. And then once in Thread, young people stay with us for 10 years. So we longer than your average American marriage. It's a big commitment. It is also like a gang or a sorority. I think sorority is a little meaner than gangs, but you can't get out. So once you're in thread, you're in thread. Everyone tries to get out at some point. They say, I'm dropping out, and we say, yeah, that's great, we'll just keep showing up. So, and then during that time, each young person has 4 adults that become extended family. So think about what neighbors used to do 60 years ago before we became this hyper-individualistic society. And so those 4 adults do what you would do for your own children. It might be the packing lunches or rides to school. It might be supporting the parent and finding a job. It might be helping the younger siblings to get enrolled in daycare. It is integrating into the lives of our young people and their families, and then it's also them integrating into our lives. For us, success is when you can name the family members and the children and the parents of everyone within your Thread family.
One of the things you described earlier in terms of why Thread worked, in terms of how it was able to cultivate trust, is that whole like honey badger thing, that you have to be willing to be rejected over and over and just kind of wear them down in a way, to just say, I'm actually not going to leave you alone until we connect.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's the thing that's very radical about Thread is our set of norms. So we function in our community with a very non-dominant set of norms. Things like, we talk about showing all the way up, being your full self, being vulnerable. But what that also means is, within the dominant construct, one of the key things is perfectionism, right? And so perfectionism, if that is the culture in which we've all been indoctrinated into, when you show up at 7 in the morning to give someone a ride to school and they won't get in the car, that actually is something that hits at your very identity. It's not a small thing. That sense of failure is a deep thing. And so in Thread, everyone has a coach. The 4 adults are coached by what's called a head of family. That person's role is really to coach the adults on their journey about how to live a different way, how to live in a community that functions in this non-dominant way. And it's so counterculture that it takes both norming and group spaces. So an example of that, we had a holiday party, and we had 700 people at this holiday party, and students, volunteers, board members, staff, and instead of having a young person stand up and talk about, oh, thank you for this ride to school, and I was hungry and you gave me food, we had a board member stand up. And the board member shared, this is someone who I'd asked to the board. He's in private equity. So his job is, once someone has invested $10 or $20 million, once his company has made the investment, it's to go tell the CEO that if you continue behaving the way you've been behaving, we're going to fire you. So here's the next steps to keeping your job. So I thought, let's bring him on the board and he can teach me how to do my job. This would be very helpful. And so he came on, but he was coached on how to be vulnerable, and how to be part of this culture. And so he stood up in front of 700 people and explained how he had been sober from drugs and alcohol for the past 6 years because of the relationships he had in Thread. Wow. Yeah, so imagine you're a young person who's been told your entire life that you're less than, that you're disadvantaged, that you are all these things, right? And then someone is standing up and saying, me too. Like, we all have problems. We all have things we go through. And the only way to get through them is together and in relationship with one another. And so, when you think about, but that's not our normal culture. And so you have to norm that. And it takes norming it both in group spaces like a holiday party, but in one-on-one coaching.
Well, and one of the other norms of our culture, especially as it relates to school, is just in performance. I'm sure there were plenty of parents, maybe you encounter this or not, but I'm sure there are plenty of parents who say, yes, I would like for my child to enjoy school and to feel good, but they have to take a test at the end of the year. Like, I need to know what their grades are, they need to get through the standardized test, they need to get accepted to school, they need to get the hell out of this neighborhood and build a life, whether they feel good about it or not.
Yes, but for us, this has been a very interesting conversation, over a decade. What we want for our young people and for everyone in Thread is to find what my colleague Delchian termed being on your dot. It's the intersection of your passion, your skills, and what the world needs, because that's where you find your purpose. And we believe that you can only figure that out through relationship with other people, because that's how you begin to know yourself better and to know the world around you. And so yes, we want our young people to graduate from high school. In Baltimore City, only 6% of young people with GPAs of less than 1.0 in their freshman year graduate. In Thread, it's 71%. If you extend out to 6 years, it's 85%. So yes, I want Thread young people, I want my daughter Evie to graduate from high school, but I want them to find their place in the world. And I think part of that is being in a diverse group of people where you can understand what all of the possibilities are.
Finding your place in the world might be a good place to come to you, Dylan Tett, and talk about Bastion Community of Resilience, which is a housing community for veterans and families with life-altering injuries. You came to develop this as a result of your experiences as an Army Ranger who had served in Iraq. Talk about coming home from that service and beginning to kind of view wounded warriors in a different way.
Yeah. So just a clarification, I was Ranger qualified. I wasn't in Ranger Regiment.
Thank you.
But yeah, at the time that I had redeployed from Iraq and moved my family to New Orleans 3 months before Katrina, I used all those good skills that I learned in the Army to rebuild the greatest American city. And I was using the Work as Therapy program, which didn't work so well for me because at a certain point, I just became so despondent and depressed and carrying so much survivor's guilt. I felt alone and isolated and cut off from everyone that I loved so dearly. It was actually a group of kids, Gold Star kids, at an adventure camp here in Colorado. It's called Knights of Heroes, that taught me a new expression of courage. And so in using service, I found a group of children who I thought needed me, and in fact, I needed them. And that was the beginning of a 10-year journey to return all the way home. At the same point, or at the same time, I had a lot of friends coming home from Iraq and Afghanistan with traumatic brain injury, which is the signature wound from the War on Terror. And I saw what was happening in their lives. I knew what was going on in my life. And I decided to do something about it. I went around the country. I visited places like the Intrepid Center in San Antonio, Walter Reed and the Traumatic Brain Injury Center there. And then I visited a group home where the VA was putting warriors who needed assistance in the activities of daily life. And I remember walking in this group home. If you can imagine kind of a rural setting, this home was very much by itself. There wasn't anyone around. You had to take a shuttle into town. And I saw this young man sitting on the couch. He was kind of slumped over to one side, his eyes glazed over, and he was drooling out the side of his mouth. And I just thought at that moment, we can do better than this. And so I stumbled on a blueprint to build an entire neighborhood for these warriors and their families. We call it Bastion. We were able to, it took me 5 years to convince enough people that this crazy idea would work, but we broke ground in 2016. We put 58 apartment homes on a 5.5-acre campus. It's got a wellness center, lots of green space. And then we decided to invite civilian volunteers to live as neighbors and be part of the care team. And that's all working very beautifully. We have a trained professional staff, but really, Joshua, the real work is kind of pushing the boundaries and what the community can do for itself. And it's just amazing what you can do when you decide to intentionally neighbor, right? We designed Bastion in such a way so that we maximize collisions, so that if you go check your mail or walk your dog, chances are you'll bump into your neighbor and hey, how are you? And well, I'm not doing so okay. And then that starts a conversation, and you cannot isolate at Bastion. We turned all the front doors, instead of street-facing doors, we turned them inside so that it creates a common courtyard. And we have a program that really drives a successful, healthy, optimal trajectory for recovery and reintegration, and that's what it's all about.
Now, you decided to build a whole new community, a physical space that would allow for these collisions, as you described it. It's very different from the approach that I think a lot of civilians who can't relate to military service or traumatic brain injury have, where we look at a place like Walter Reed and say, Walter Reed should be better. They should treat those people better there, maybe different volunteers there. But your solution wasn't to fix that place. It was to build a different kind of place.
Well, that's the thing of it. We can deliver the best state-of-the-art medical care, but that is really only half the equation. You can't expect a hospital to build all of the support and infrastructure around a family in a city. That's not their job. So what we are providing is something that the Department of Defense and the Department of VA cannot provide because they're just not equipped to do it. But yet, it is the community, it is the role of community that's so critical to the ongoing recovery and reintegration. I mean, I think you can look at, even if you just look at the benefits of mental health on an individual level, I think what a lot of people are seeing, that the benefits of mental health over time begin to diminish if you're not part of a greater community to keep you moving, to keep you, healthy and moving forward.
How do you convince people to be part of that community? I imagine some of them were really skeptical at first.
Well, it's not very hard, actually. For warriors, I mean, you just get it. You miss that camaraderie. I mean, when you have forged such strong bonds, in an environment like the military, it's hard to break those bonds. In fact, I think we suffer a type of loss when we lose our military family as we move out of the military. And so part of our job was just recreating that military family. And one of the models of resilience is doing just that. It's recreating this psychological family, inviting others into your innermost circle of trust, and that begins to, that's the starting point.
I guess I mean more like the neighbors around the community, the
yeah.
civilians who were
Right.
going to integrate and help out.
Well, we had to educate our neighbors. There was this stigma we had to overcome that, veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan are these broken toys with post-traumatic stress who are going to shoot up the place. And we had to do a lot of education. And then once they were able to meet these warriors and their family members, then it was, oh, well, okay, I get it now.
Is the plan for the veterans who live there to remain there? Is the plan for them to be able to move out somewhere else on their own? What's the goal?
Yeah, good question. Well, we designed it from the ground up to support warriors who need assistance in the activities of daily living. So if you think about the most catastrophic injury, you're talking about someone who needs help toileting and getting dressed and eating. So it's designed to support those kind of warriors, and we have 2 of them that will be moving in at the end of the year. But then when we opened it up last year, a lot of warriors who were just struggling with depression or post-traumatic stress, anxiety, so these are higher functioning, they're already getting better and moving out and doing great things for the country again. So it's really both.
I imagine there are some folks who just don't want to look at the cost of war in the body of a human being. Like that's hard to sit with and look at a person and say, like, you are the cost of war. This is what the cost of war looks like. Even if I want to help you, I don't even know how to sit with you.
Yeah, I mean, we'll be paying for these wars for generations. And it's really interesting. It's been observed now that there are secondary symptoms of post-traumatic stress. So the trauma that I carry as a grown man, the potential is for me to pass it on to my children. And so there are military kids who are exhibiting some of the same, and caregivers and spouses who are exhibiting some of the same symptoms. And so you think about that. you know, we're talking about generations now that will be dealing with the after effects of these wars for many, many years.
Before I come to Aisha, I just wanted to check in with y'all if there's anybody who's got some good questions that might be percolating that you might want to share. Maybe one or two? Okay, if we have time, we'll try to move the microphones around and get some questions from you. But let me come now to Aisha Butler, who is the co-founder and president of RAGE, the Resident Association of Greater Englewood in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood. Aisha, tell us about the Englewood neighborhood. What's it like?
So it's in Chicago. And if you know Chicago, a lot of people coined our city as a tale of two cities. So you have one area of Chicago that is just as beautiful as what we see out here. The sun is shining, flowers are blooming. And you have another area of Chicago like Englewood where there's a constant cloud over because of systematic racism, because of 30 years of injustice, social and economic injustice, because of white flight, black flight, demolitions, the loss of schools. So this cloud stays over our neighborhood. And then on top of the cloud, the media talks about the cloud every single night. So if you live in the community, you start feeling that darkness. So I could say I was a victim of that. I bought my house in 2002 on a block that I'm shocked I survived. I mean, I had post-traumatic stress syndrome because bullets did fly through my block. Bullet flew through my house. Bullets flew through my neighbor's house. And it's this frustration that I had for years just to really follow the trend and get out of Chicago. A lot of folks have left. Over 300,000 African Americans have left the city of Chicago. And many have left Englewood.
I'm sorry, if we could just
Yeah.
contextualize that. The interesting thing about that is that Chicago was one of the sites of the Great Migration.
It was.
Where blacks fled to Chicago from the South.
Opportunities, yep.
And yet you were thinking about fleeing from Chicago back south to Atlanta? Is it?
Yes, which is the trend, which has happened. Just because I was just tired. I didn't know I couldn't raise my daughter. I didn't know if I was gonna get shot. But just like many other panelists talked about, it was that moment where you look outside. I was looking outside on my block, and Englewood has over 5,000 vacant lots that are owned by the city because of demolition. So once you go in foreclosure, they pretty much knock down the home. So I have this lot across the street, and it's these kids in this lot, and fun to them is breaking glass, picking up dirt, playing with tires, possibly getting hit by a car that's, rolling past. And I told my husband, I said, look at these kids, like it's this beautiful little girl with a dress on in the dirt. And so I always get choked up because it was like that pivotal point for me. And I told him, we can't leave. I gotta stay. I can't isolate myself and not know my neighbors. I have to do something. But my to-do was to meet other people like me who knew that we could add value but didn't know how. So I just became a super volunteer and volunteered all throughout the community. I always laugh at my mother because she says, you took the Magnificent Mile, because that's where I used to work, to Englewood, and you bring Englewood to the Magnificent Mile. and I always used to say it was tough for me to come downtown to see all of this investment and then to look across the street at this little girl playing in dirt. And so that kind of started my journey of lighting up this community and then building a whole army of other light workers so that cloud doesn't exist in Englewood.
What was it like beginning to spark those lights? Were people ready for it? Were they skeptical? I imagine there were plenty of folks like you who looked around and said, I can't have this, but I don't know what to do, and I don't even know if it's safe to step outside to do anything.
Right. and people still feel that way. But I think what I did first, I started a blog. So I go by the name Mrs. Englewood because I feel like I'm married to the community. And at that point, you know, I was gonna get a divorce and go to Atlanta, but I'm still married. I still have vows there. So I actually just started writing about my experiences. And then as I was volunteering, it prompted me to start a youth, it really wasn't for youth, but it was for youth and elders, our baby boomers, to sit in a room together and dialogue around critical issues that affect our community. And when I use film to do that and called it Docs and Dialogue, just documentaries and dialogue, people start coming out and saying, I want to be a part of this. What is this? Is it a group? And it wasn't a group. We actually said we're an undefined movement. We didn't have a definition. I met more and more neighbors like that. And then they would tell me, well, I write curriculum. I'm a teacher. I live right down the block. I can help you with this. Or I'm a photographer. Let me document this work for you. So it started being more and more of those people coming out. And we started aggressively changing the narrative that we saw every night on the 6 o'clock news. So much so, our clothes, our names, our wristbands, it's Englewood, Englewood, Englewood. So just to have a totally different counter narrative. So now people are like, wait, this was already here? And it was. And I think the difference is it was a cultural movement. I always say it's community development of the mind first. I couldn't just build a house. I had to build people love and value for the community. And we have to do it together. I have to value my community first before I can get other people to feel the same way.
Talk about the larger impact you had on Chicago and as the city began to notice. I mean, it's one thing for, you know, some lazy assignment editor in a news station to just listen to the police scanner and wait to hear Englewood and say, okay, that'll be our Englewood story for tonight, which is just pathetically lazy. But when you were able to start making change, how did you know that the city of Chicago noticed Englewood in a different way?
First, we started getting phone calls. They said, oh, we need Rage to be in a conversation around community development, or we need the residents of your association to sit on a panel, or to serve on a council with the city. And then we had a policy, because that vacant lot across the street, the city owned it. And I talked to my alderman and I said, I want to get that lot. I want to transform that lot. And he said, oh yeah, no problem. We'll make it work for you. But then I got a letter that denied me from getting that lot and said there was no program in place for me to get the lot across the street from me. And so it was a plan happening with the city and CMAP and some other folks. And I started saying that residents like myself should be able to purchase any of these city-owned lots. You're looking on a block with 10 vacant lots. Why I can't have 2 or 3 of them, right? For $1. Hopefully no taxes, but that didn't fly. But they did listen. And they said, you know what, let's do a survey, let's have some community meetings. And the city followed our lead. And then the next thing you know, a program called Large Lot was born, and it started in Englewood, and now it's throughout the whole entire city. So that's when I knew that our voice actually was making it was actually being heard, and that change was happening.
What did those lots turn into?
So we have a variety of different things. Right now, I do art in the lot, gardening. One of my members called her lot the Promised Land. She has a stage. People do various things. And we made the program so that you could do whatever you wanted to do with that lot.
We got a few minutes for questions. I know you raised your hand, so while we move the mic down here, I wanted to put one more question to kind of anyone who wants to answer. I noticed, Aisha, the acronym for your program, Resident Association of Greater Englewood, spells RAGE.
Yes.
Talk about the role of anger,
Yeah.
of being pissed,
Yeah.
in being active.
Yeah.
How does that factor? Dylan?
Yeah, well, to take it back to that story, I don't know, it just felt to me like I could physically feel this in my body, this disdain, this disgust, that we could send some of our best and brightest off and not pick up the tab on the back end of it. And yeah, I was enraged. I think it's actually a characteristic of resilience. I think you have to experience that anger and channel it, right? You want to channel it into a healthy, appropriate way. But yes, I mean, there were times in the development of Bastion, it took me 5 years to get this thing off the ground, and I nearly, I scraped the bottom of my checking account twice. I almost folded. I had an important meeting lined up that meant everything to the future of Bastion, and I was prepared to let it go. And then I walked into the room. I think I locked the door behind me, and I sat down next to this guy, and I said, "Give me $1 million." Because I was just so mad. I was so angry. It was that anger. It came back. After I'd made my peace with it, I was so enraged. He didn't give me $1 million. He was a beautiful man. He gave me $250,000, but that got us to groundbreaking.
Not close enough. Not close enough. We got a few minutes left for questions. If you would please just tell your name, where you're from, if you're with an organization,
Great.
and then your question. Keep it tight if you can, and if you would direct it to one of the guests. We'll try to get to as many as we can, and then you, ma'am, we'll send you the mic next. Hi.
So my name is Chip Edens, and I am a pastor of a large church engaged in a lot of community development. And what I know is one of the scariest things that vulnerable people can hear is, "We're here to help."
Yeah.
And so I'd like to just, I'm curious about the people questioning your motives, maybe when you first got involved, and how you went about the work of building trust, and how you maintain trust and stay focused, maybe not on what you perceive to be what you think is in someone's best interest, but staying in touch with what's perhaps in their best interest.
So questioning motives and keeping the best interest of
Exactly. And building trust. Building trust.
Alejandro, go ahead.
Yeah, I think the framing isn't so much "we're here to help." I think it's more "we're here because we need help." That's the message that resonates, and I think this is what Thread gets at as well. The only way that we get the turnout that we do in Springboard programming is because the teacher shows up in the home. They articulate, "You and I share a goal for your kid. We want them to be a successful reader. And I need you to make it happen." It's not, I can help you. It's you're the only person that has one-on-one time with your child. You have a wealth of knowledge about your child that grows every year that I could never have, and I need you in order to make that happen. And it's that vulnerability that then leads to the turnout and the dialogue.
Sarah, did you want to?
I was just going to say, words and intentions really don't matter. What matters is your actions. So, the way we've kind of done it over time is, for example, one of the most profound relationships I've ever had is with a young woman, Judy. She'd been badly abused by a family member, suffered from severe anxiety and depression, failing out of school. It's just showing up, rides home from school, camping trips, just kind of, dragging. What's fascinating, though, is that she graduated from high school, graduated from college, actually got her master's degree a couple weeks ago. And when I asked her, what type of nurse are you going to be? She said, a mental health nurse. And I said, why mental health? She said, well, because when you have heart disease, dementia, cancer, your family flocks to you. When you have a mental health challenge, everybody runs away. She says, I want to be the one person that's left when no one else is there. And so I've lost 3 of my female family members to suicide. And so you fast forward, I had a car accident almost 3 years ago now, really bad concussion, so sick that I lost 40 pounds. My body was just a complete disaster. I was driving home one day, had a massive panic attack. Lasted 6 hours. And it's not like I don't have plenty of people I can call. But the question is, when you're humiliated, frightened, and don't know what to do, who do you call? And it's call Judy, right? And so the only way it works is if it's real, and the realness has to be who are you calling at 3 in the morning when things are really bad? And then when things are really great, our daughters being born 5 months apart, who are you taking to the pool on a Saturday? And that requires time.
Aisha, and then we'll get to your question.
I was just going to say, my mother and father met in Englewood on 63rd and Halsted. I went to Catholic school there. I met my husband there. When I started doing community work, I was an outsider to people. They didn't know who I was, where I came from. So I didn't go in doing. I went in and I hate to say, I weave myself with what was already happening. If you were passing out food, I helped you do that. And I did that consistently until I saw a gap and said, wait, our elders and our young people are not working together. Then I saw another gap. Resident voice is not being valued. And I created when I saw gaps, but I really did not come in helping. I came in saying, this is my community too. I know you guys, I didn't grow up in your block, but let's all work together. And I was consistent, and I never came with, I'm trying to help this community.
One last question before we go. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Jessica. I'm right now a Public and Government Affairs Advisor at ExxonMobil, and in my spare time, I'm very involved in volunteering activities. And my question is, so I actually grew up in an inner city neighborhood, and when I went to Princeton, I went back to inner city Trenton to do some work. My question is, I feel like both for myself and for so many of my peers, what I see is it's really the psychological aspect that holds people back, whether it's the extenuating circumstances like domestic violence or poverty or hunger that it creates a lasting impact. And so how do we counter that psychological damage, and any advice that you guys would have to that extent?
Let's get one quick response before we got to go. Anybody?
I would just constantly highlight, show another view, because we deal with that in Englewood, and it has been, people feel so hopeless, and if you could just show hope and constantly do it and change the culture, and it got to be rooted in love. I think it starts to shift. It slowly shifts, and that's what happened with us.
One last question I would ask each of you for the work that you're doing, which is amazing work. What do you need now? What do you need that either your local community can provide, that someone in this room can provide, to take what you're doing to the next level? Alejandro, what do you need to take what you're doing to the next level?
I appreciate the question. Three things come to mind. One, advice and insights. As a young entrepreneur growing an organization, the challenges that we're navigating around scale, financial sustainability, they're familiar to anyone who's grown any business. And so part of my motivation in navigating this space is gathering those insights. Another, of course, as a nonprofit, is financial capital. We are on the path to a break even, and we charge a fee for service for our work. But in order to bring those products to life and to capitalize our growth, we raise philanthropic resources, so that is a continual need that any nonprofit grapples with. But then the third is also social capital. I think that in the philanthropy space, people often, you think first of the financial capital, and that's usually what the conversation is about. But the power here, every bit as much as the wealth, it is the social interconnectedness. It's introductions, it's bringing somebody along to an informal gathering, and it's that social capital that when we can reallocate it and distribute it to communities that don't necessarily have it, there's enormous leverage there.
Sarah, what do you need?
All right, three quick questions. Raise your hand, please, if you yourself, a friend or a family member that you know has struggled with mental illness. Okay. Raise your hand if you or a friend or family member has struggled with drug or alcohol addiction. Okay. Raise your hand if you're living in severe poverty. Okay. So what I need from you is to continuously acknowledge that we all have challenges, that it is not one group that needs to be fixed and a group that's going to do the fixing. And the thing that you can do is pick someone here that maybe you micro-judge them a little bit. You saw them say something you didn't like or wear something, and ask them to go for a walk. And just share about yourself. Practice in little increments, sharing about who you are. If we can all do that, that is the culture that we need to scale. That is the new set of norms that will actually bring about sustained change.
Dylan, what do you need?
I'm putting together a $30 million investment fund to seed 5 to 7 more Bastions over the next several years. But like Sarah, I would be remiss if I didn't say, we don't have to start a nonprofit or build a $13 million neighborhood. The tools to bridging the gap and building community are accessible to everyone. They're right here on the table, right in front of you. And it's those small daily interactions that I think can really mean the difference in building and strengthening the communities in which we live.
And before we go, Aisha, what do you need?
I need everyone to say Englewood is rising right now for me on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3.
Englewood is rising.
Thank you. I need that affirmation. And if you are in journalism or you have also these social networks and you hear the negative things that is said about Englewood, please be an ambassador and say, I heard another story. You don't know it all. It is some people like Aisha Butler and a whole bunch of others who are doing great work. That's one thing. And then I am looking at our community, really to have a capital development fund. People are really afraid that gentrification is going to push a lot of us out. And so we're trying to get in front of it. And so conversations around how to do balanced development in a community like Englewood, I will be open to that.
Aisha Butler, the co-founder and president of RAGE, the Resident Association of Greater Englewood in Chicago's Englewood neighborhood. Dylan Tett, the founder of Bastion Community of Resilience. Sarah Heminger, the co-founder of Frayed. And Alejandro Gibbes de Gac, the founder of Springboard Collaborative. Alejandro, Sarah, Dylan, Aisha, thanks for talking to us.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your time at the festival.